They say grief is a hole in the heart, but for me, it was a lens. It allowed me to see exactly who was standing over my husband's casket, and who was already eyeing the jewelry on his cold, stiff fingers. My husband, Terry, wasn't even in the ground for an hour before my son-in-law started carving up our life like a Sunday roast. He thought he was outsmarting a grieving widow. He thought 60 years of life had made me soft and forgetful. What he didn't realize is that when you take everything from a woman who has nothing left to lose, you aren't just stealing memories. You're inviting a demon into your home. And honey, I've been keeping that demon fed for a long, long time. Before we get into how I dismantled this man's entire existence without ever calling a cop, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You're watching Vintage Vengeance, where we prove that age isn't a weakness, it's a weapon. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. The air in the living room felt heavy, thick with the scent of lilies and the underlying rot of hypocrisy. Terry was gone. My rock, my partner for 40 years, reduced to an iron and a collection of stories that people were already starting to tell wrong. I sat in my high-back chair, the one Terry bought me for our silver anniversary. I felt like a ghost in my own home. My daughter, Maya, was in the kitchen, her eyes swollen and red. She was fragile, always had been. But her husband, Byron was moving through my house with a tape measure in his eyes. I watched him. He was a tall man, polished, the kind of man who wore a suit to a backyard barbecue just to remind everyone he made 6 figures. He didn't come over to comfort me. He didn't offer to help with the arrangements. Instead, I caught him in the hallway, running his hand over the mahogany sideboard. "Mama Ruby," Byron said, his voice dripping with that fake, oily sympathy. "You know, this house is an awful lot for a woman your age to manage alone. All these things, they are just dust collectors now, aren't they?" I gripped the arms of my chair. "Those things are my life, Byron. Every piece of wood in this house was earned with sweat and sacrifice. Terry and I built this." Byron smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was a predatory look. Of course. But Maya and I were thinking, maybe it's time to declutter. Simplify. We have that big storage unit, and we could keep the important stuff safe for you. You shouldn't have to worry about maintenance. He wasn't talking about maintenance. He was talking about the heirlooms. He was talking about the hand-carved trunk in the basement that belonged to my great-grandmother, a piece of history that survived the Great Migration. He was talking about the jars in the cellar that he thought were just old preserves. "I'm not moving a single soul out of this house, Byron," I said firmly. He didn't argue. He just nodded, that chilling, patient nod of a man who knows he's going to get what he wants anyway. The betrayal didn't happen all at once. It happened in the quiet hours after the funeral, when the house was supposed to be a sanctuary. I had fallen into a deep, medicated sleep, the kind of sleep that grief forces on you when your brain can't take any more reality. When I woke up the next morning, the house felt empty. Not just empty of Terry, but empty of life. I walked into the hallway. The sideboard was gone. The walls were bare where the portraits of our ancestors once hung. I stumbled down to the basement, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The trunk was gone. Byron hadn't just taken clutter. He had backed a U-Haul up to my life while I was unconscious and stripped the marrow from the bone. He took the letters Terry wrote me from the front lines. He took the quilt my mother finished on her deathbed. He took the journals, the ones that contained the secrets of our family's special recipes and our history. But there was one thing he took that made my blood turn to ice. In the back of that mahogany trunk, hidden beneath a false bottom, was a small, heavy iron box. It didn't have money in it. It didn't have gold. It had the debt. Byron thought he was stealing a legacy of wealth. He thought he was taking items he could sell to some high-end boutique or keep to prove his status. He didn't realize that some things are kept under lock and key not because they are valuable, but because they are contagious. I walked back upstairs and sat in the center of the empty living room. My knees ached and my vision blurred, but I didn't cry. You only cry when there's hope. I was far past hope. I picked up the phone and dialed Maya. She picked up on the third ring, her voice trembling. Mama, Byron said you agreed. He said you wanted the house cleared out so you wouldn't be reminded of the pain. Maya, I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. Put Byron on the phone. He's busy, Mama. He's in the garage going through the boxes. He's so excited about that old iron box he found. He says it's an antique. A cold smile spread across my face. Tell him to keep it. Tell him it's his now. Every bit of it. Tell him he's officially part of the family legacy. I hung up. Byron wanted everything. He wanted to be the head of the family. He wanted the power that Terry held. Well, he was about to find out that Terry didn't hold that power alone. He took the box. He took the jars. He took the history. Now, I was going to make sure he felt the weight of every single thing he stole. He wanted to play vulture. Fine. I'm the one who taught the vultures how to eat. Byron didn't call me back that night. He was too busy playing king in his suburban fortress, surrounded by my memories like they were trophies from a hunt. He thought he'd silenced the old woman. He thought he'd managed the grief-stricken widow and cleared the path for his own ambition. But Byron didn't know the difference between an heirloom and a hitchhiker. Some things don't like being moved, and some things don't like being owned by the wrong hands. I spent the evening sitting on the floor of my empty living room. The hardwood was cold against my bones, but the chill inside me was sharper. I didn't need the furniture to feel at home. I needed the silence to plan. My mind wasn't on the mahogany or the quilts anymore. It was on those jars he took from the cellar, the ones labeled with dates that went back further than the house itself. Byron probably thought it was moonshine or expensive preserves. He likely imagined selling them to some boutique organic market for a premium. Poor, greedy Byron. He didn't realize that those jars contained the settlings of our family's history. Dirt from the doorsteps of houses we were forced out of. Ash from the hearths of ancestors who had to flee in the middle of the night. Hair, fingernails, and the dry breath of people who died with a debt unpaid. In our family, we don't just bury our problems. We bottle them. And Byron just opened the pantry. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Maya. Mama, Byron is acting strange. He opened that iron box you mentioned. He's been sitting in the garage for 3 hours just staring at the floor. He won't eat. He says the air feels thick. Is there something in those old things that could make him sick? Mold, maybe. I stared at the screen, my face a mask of stone. Mold. No, Maya. It wasn't mold. It was accountability. Tell him to breathe deep, Maya, I whispered to the empty room. That's the scent of the people he's trying to replace. I didn't reply to her. Instead, I stood up, my joints popping like dry kindling. I walked to the kitchen and opened the one cabinet Byron had missed because it looked like a built-in panel. Inside was a single, small glass vial. It wasn't an heirloom. It was a catalyst. See, Byron had a routine. Every Tuesday morning at 5 a.m., he went to his high-end gym. He prided himself on his discipline. He thought his physical strength made him superior. He thought his youth made him untouchable. After his workout, he'd stop at the same juice bar and order a power green smoothie. I knew the owner of that juice bar, a woman named Zora. We went to the same church for 30 years. She knew what Byron had done. She'd seen the U-Haul. News travels fast in our community, especially when a son-in-law acts like a grave robber. I didn't need a lawyer to sue him. I didn't need a court to tell me he was a thief. I was going to use the one thing Byron valued more than his reputation, his control. I drove over to Zora's place in the dark. The streets were quiet, the streetlights flickering like tired eyes. When I pulled up, she was already at the back door, smoking a thin cigarette. She looked at the vial in my hand, then looked at me. He took the trunk. Ruby? She asked, her voice raspy. He took the trunk. He took the jars. He took Terry's military medals, I said. Zora spat on the ground. A man who steals from the dead is already halfway in the dote himself. You sure about this? Once the fever starts, it don't stop until the debt is square. I've never been sure of anything in my 60 years, I replied. He wanted the family legacy. I'm just making sure he digests it properly. I handed her the vial. It wasn't poison, not the kind a doctor could find in a blood test. Anyway, it was a concentrated tincture of the bitter root Terry's grandfather brought up from the Delta. It doesn't kill you. It just makes your skin feel like it's crawling with ants. It makes every light too bright, every sound too loud, and every memory of your own sins feel like a physical weight on your chest. It triggers a psychological collapse that looks like a nervous breakdown but feels like a haunting. Tuesday morning, Zora said, pocketing the vial. He won't even taste the justice. I drove back home and finally slept. I slept like a baby because I knew that by dawn, Byron's world was going to start shrinking. He thought he was a big man because he had a big house filled with my things. But he was about to find out that those things were heavy. When Tuesday morning came, I waited. I sat on my porch, rocking in a chair I'd borrowed from a neighbor. At 7:30 a.m., the calls started. Maya was hysterical. Mama! Byron collapsed at the gym. They took him to the ER, but the doctors can't find anything. He's screaming that his skin is on fire, but there's no rash. He keeps saying he sees people standing in the corners of the room, people in old-fashioned clothes. Mama, he's terrified. I took a slow sip of my tea. The sun was hitting the spot where my mahogany sideboard used to be. The house was empty, but for the first time since the funeral, I felt like I was winning. Maybe he's just overwhelmed by all that clutter he took. Maya, I said calmly. Possessions have a way of owning you if you aren't careful. Tell him I'm praying for him. Tell him I'm praying real hard. I hung up. This was just the beginning. Byron hadn't even reached the part of the legacy that involved the jars yet. He'd only tasted the root. He hadn't met the ancestors who lived in the wood of that trunk. He wanted to take everything. Fine. I was going to make sure he felt every ounce of it until he begged me to take it back. But I wouldn't. Not until he was stripped as bare as he left my hallway. The hospital couldn't find a single thing wrong with Byron's blood. They ran every test, scans, panels, toxins, and every result came back as clean as a new whistle. But Byron wasn't clean. He was vibrating. Maya called me from the waiting room, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She said he was clawing at his arms, screaming that the air felt like it was made of wool. He said he could hear a rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, coming from inside the walls of the hospital. I knew that sound. It wasn't his heart. It was the sound of the mahogany trunk settling into its new home. You see, that wood wasn't just timber. It was harvested from a hanging tree back in the old country, a tree that had seen too much sorrow to ever truly be silent. Terry and I kept it in the basement for a reason. The damp earth and the quiet of the cellar kept the wood dormant. But Byron, he put it in his climate-controlled, breezy suburban bedroom. He invited the restless into his sanctuary. I'm coming over. Maya, I said, my voice as smooth as river stone. Not to the hospital. To your house. I'll wait for you there. Someone needs to look after the place while you're dealing with whatever this is. I drove over to their gated community. It was a place of beige siding and manicured lawns, the kind of place where people pretend the past doesn't exist. Byron's house was a monstrosity of glass and steel, a monument to his ego. But as I pulled into the driveway, I felt a familiar shiver. The house didn't look right. The shadows under the eaves were too deep, too hungry. I let myself in with the spare key Maya gave me years ago. The moment I stepped over the threshold, the smell hit me. It wasn't the scent of Byron's expensive cologne or Maya's lavender candles. It was the smell of a freshly plowed field after a thunderstorm. It was the smell of the Delta. Byron had moved my sideboard into his dining room. It looked ridiculous there, surrounded by his modern minimalist chairs. It looked like a king forced to sit at a children's table. I walked over and ran my hand along the wood. It was hot. Not warm, hot. You don't like it here, do you? I whispered to the grain of the wood. I walked upstairs to their master suite. There it was. The mahogany trunk sat at the foot of their king-sized bed. Byron had already pried it open. He'd tossed my mother's quilts onto the floor like they were rags, and he'd opened the false bottom. The iron box was sitting on his nightstand, wide open. He had touched the debt. I looked inside the box. The contents were gone. It wasn't money he found. It was a collection of links. Iron rings, rusted and pitted, each one representing a person our family had lost to the cruelty of men like Byron, men who thought they could own things they didn't build. By touching those rings with greed in his heart, Byron had linked himself to every single one of them. Suddenly, the front door slammed downstairs. I didn't jump. I just turned slowly as Byron stumbled into the room, supported by a frantic Maya. He looked terrible. His skin was a grayish hue, and his eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room as if he were being hunted. When he saw me standing by the trunk, he flinched. "Mama Ruby!" Maya gasped. "What are you doing up here?" "I was just checking on my things, Maya," I said. "Byron looks like he's seen a ghost." Byron lunged toward me, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the quilt he'd discarded. Get it out," he wheezed. His voice sounded like he'd been swallowing glass. "The noise, Ruby. Make the noise stop. It's clicking. It's clicking in my ears." "That's just the wood expanding, Byron," I said, leaning over him. I could smell the bitter root sweating out of his paws. "Or maybe it's the sound of the years you tried to steal. You thought you could just take a life's work and not take the life that went with it." "I'll give it back," he shrieked, his fingernails digging into the plush carpet. "Take it all. Just make the itching stop. I feel like I'm being buried alive." I looked at Maya. She was frozen, looking between her husband and her mother. She saw the coldness in my eyes, and for the first time, she saw who I really was. I wasn't the sweet grandmother who baked peach cobblers. I was the keeper of the jars. "He can't just give it back, Maya," I said. "You don't throw away a legacy once you've claimed it. He wanted to be the man of the house. Well, now he's the man of this house. And this house is full." I walked over to the nightstand and picked up the empty iron box. "He shouldn't have opened the jars, Maya." "Did he open the jars in the basement?" Maya nodded slowly, her eyes wide with terror. He thought it was vintage wine. He broke one. He got angry because it was just dirt and hair. He poured it down the sink." I felt a surge of righteous fury, but I kept my face still. "He poured the ancestors down the drain. He treated our history like refuse." "Well," I said, tucking the iron box under my arm, "then the debt is no longer just about furniture, Byron. You poured them into the pipes. You poured them into the foundation of this house. You wanted our history. Now you're going to live in it. Literally." Byron started to scream then, a high, thin sound that didn't sound human. He started scratching at his throat, claiming he could feel hair growing inside his windpipe. I didn't call for help. I didn't offer a glass of water. I simply walked toward the door. "Mama, wait!" Maya cried, reaching for my arm. "You have to help him. You know what this is." I pulled my arm away. I told him not to move a single soul out of my house, Maya. He didn't listen. Now, he's going to learn that some things are heavier than they look. I'm going home now. My house is very quiet. I think I'll enjoy the silence. As I walked down the stairs, I heard the mahogany sideboard in the dining room let out a loud, echoing crack. It sounded like a bone breaking. Byron thought he took everything. He didn't realize he'd just volunteered to be the vessel for everything we'd been trying to keep contained for a century. I drove home in the moonlight, the iron box heavy on the seat beside me. Byron's suburban dream was rotting from the inside out, and the neighbors were starting to talk. You know, the kind of neighborhood where a blade of grass out of place is a scandal and a peeling shutter is a crime. But what was happening at Byron and Maya's house couldn't be fixed with a lawnmower or a coat of paint. It was a sickness of the soil itself. I sat on my porch back at the old house, rocking steadily. My hallway was still empty, my walls still bare, but the air here was clean. The weight had shifted. I could feel it through the soles of my feet, a distant vibration coming from 3 miles away where Byron was currently drowning in his own greed. The phone rang at noon. It was Maya again, but this time she wasn't crying. She sounded hollow, like someone who had spent the night staring into a dark well. "Mama," she whispered. "The water. It's turned. It's not right." Byron tried to take a shower to wash off the crawling feeling, but the water coming out of the pipes, it smells like a swamp. "It's thick, Mama. It's gray and full of grit." I closed my eyes, imagining it. Byron, the man who spent $50 on a haircut and wore silk undershirts, standing under a stream of ancestral life. "That's just the sediment. Maya," I said, my voice as cold as a winter grave. He poured the jars down the drain. "Remember? He thought he was getting rid of trash. But you can't wash away a bloodline. It just circles back through the pipes." "Mama, please," she begged. "He's losing his mind. He's in the backyard right now, digging. He's digging with his bare hands under the patio. He says he hears Terry calling him from under the concrete. He says he needs to give it back, but he doesn't know what it is anymore." "He knows," I said. "He just doesn't want to admit it." I hung up and went down to my cellar. Even though Byron had cleared out the shelves, the smell of the earth remained. I walked to the corner where the largest jar had sat, the one labeled 1924. That was the year my grandfather's brother was taken by a mob for the crime of owning a successful blacksmith shop. They didn't just kill him, they burned his shop and threw his tools into the river. My grandfather had waded into that freezing water and recovered a single iron hammerhead. He'd ground a piece of it into dust and put it in that jar. Byron had poured that dust down his sink. He had invited the spirit of a man who was robbed of his livelihood into his pipes. I decided it was time for another visit. I needed to see the improvements Byron was making to his property. When I pulled up to the gated community, there was a white van parked out front, Elite Plumbing and Router Services. The technician was standing on the lawn, looking baffled. He was holding a length of pipe that looked like it had been choked with hair and old, rusted nails. "I've never seen anything like it," the plumber said as I walked past him. "It's like the house is rejecting the plumbing. The roots from the trees outside, they aren't just growing toward the water. They are growing into the house. They've breached the foundation in 3 places." I nodded politely. Nature has a way of reclaiming what was stolen. "Son." I walked into the house. The smell was overpowering now. It was the scent of stagnant water, old iron, and fear. Maya was sitting on the stairs, her head in her hands. Upstairs, I could hear a rhythmic thud, thud, thud. "What is he doing, Maya?" I asked. "He's nailing the windows shut," she said, not looking up. "He says the birds are screaming his name. He says the shadow people from the sideboard are trying to get out, and he has to keep them inside so the neighbors don't see." I walked into the dining room. The mahogany sideboard was still there, but it looked different. The wood seemed darker, more saturated. And there, sitting right in the middle of the polished top, was a single, muddy handprint. Byron came stumbling down the stairs, a hammer in one hand and a box of rusty nails in the other. He looked like a skeleton draped in expensive linen. His eyes were sunken, and his fingernails were broken and caked with mud. "Ruby," he hissed, lunging toward me. "You did this. You put something in those jars. You put a hex on me." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, a 60-year-old woman facing down a man half her age. "I didn't put a thing in those jars but history, Byron. You're the one who couldn't keep his hands off what didn't belong to him. You wanted the vintage look. Well, this is what vintage feels like when it's angry." "Take it back," he screamed, dropping the hammer. It dented his expensive hardwood floor, but he didn't care. "Take the furniture. Take the trunk. Take the house. Just make them stop whispering." "Whispering what, Byron?" I asked, stepping closer. "Are they talking about how you waited for Terry's heart to stop before you started looking at his watch? Are they talking about how you told Maya I was senile so you could justify stripping my home bare? Byron's face went white. He hadn't realized I knew about that. He thought his quiet manipulations were invisible. "You're a thief, Byron," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Not just of things. You tried to steal my dignity. You tried to steal my place in this family. You thought you could bury me in an empty house. But you forgot, I'm the one who knows how to talk to the dirt." Just then, a loud crack echoed from the basement. Then another. It sounded like the foundation was splitting. Water began to seep from under the baseboards, gray, gritty water that smelled of old copper and tears. "The debt is calling, Byron," I said, turning toward the door. "And it's coming up through the floorboards. You wanted to own our past. Now you're going to drown in it." I walked out of the house as the first of the neighbors began to gather on the sidewalk, pointing at the black, oily vines that were rapidly climbing the walls of Byron's pristine white mansion. I got into my car and checked the rearview mirror. I saw Maya standing in the doorway, looking at me. She didn't follow me. She couldn't. She was tied to him, and he was tied to the house. I drove away, humming a song Terry used to sing. The revenge wasn't just about the things he took. It was about showing him that some possessions have teeth. The gated community of Willow Creek was no longer a sanctuary of quiet wealth. It had become a theater of the bizarre. By Thursday, the black vines I'd seen creeping up Byron's walls had thickened into gnarled, obsidian ropes that pulsed like veins. The neighbors were terrified. The HOA had sent 3 notices, but the delivery men wouldn't even step onto the porch. They claimed the air around the house felt electric, like a storm that refused to break. Inside, Byron was unraveling. Maya had moved into the guest house over the garage, too scared to sleep in the main bedroom where the mahogany trunk Saturday. She called me, her voice a thin wire of panic. "Mama, he's lost it. He's not even going to work. He's in the basement with a sledgehammer. He says the root of the problem is under the slab. He's convinced that if he can find the jars he broke and reconstruct them, the whispering will stop." I sat in my kitchen, sipping chicory coffee. "You can't reconstruct a shattered life, Maya. And you certainly can't glue back the dust of the dead." "He's dangerous, Mama," she whispered. "He's been talking to the sideboard." I caught him feeding it. He was pouring his expensive scotch into the grain of the wood, begging it to be quiet. He's spent every dime in our liquid savings on specialists, exorcists, mediums, even a man who claimed he could cleanse the soil. None of them will stay past the driveway. "They have survival instincts," I remarked. "Byron only has greed." But Byron's greed was morphing into something more jagged: survival. That night, the vulture decided to fly one last mission. He realized that the only way to stop the haunting was to return what he took, but in his twisted, panicked mind, he thought he could trade his way out. I was woken at 2 a.m. by the sound of a heavy engine idling in my driveway. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't call the police. I reached for the iron poker by the fireplace and walked to the window. It was Byron's silver Mercedes. He was dragging something out of the trunk. It was the mahogany sideboard. He was sweating, his shirt torn, his eyes bulging in the moonlight. He looked like a man possessed. He dragged that heavy piece of furniture across my lawn, gouging deep trenches into the grass. "Take it!" he screamed at my darkened window. "Take the damn wood, Ruby!" I brought it back. "See? It's back." I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, but the wood of the sideboard was smoking. Real, gray smoke was curling off the mahogany as if it were being cooked from the inside. "It's too late to just bring it back, Byron," I said, my voice carrying through the night like a tolling bell. "You didn't just take the wood. You took the peace. You took the sanctity of this house. You can't just drop a corpse on my lawn and call it a funeral. I'll give you more." Byron shrieked. He ran back to his car and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound bag. He threw it at my feet. It burst open, spilling out gold watches, stacks of cash, and jewelry, none of it mine. I took this from the safe at the farm. I'll give you everything. Just tell them to stop. Tell the people in the walls to let me sleep. I looked down at the stolen loot. This was his criminal act. In his desperation to appease the spirits he'd stirred, he had embezzled from his own company, thinking money could buy off the ancestors. He thought he could bribe the ghosts of people who had been traded for coins their whole lives. You're a fool, Byron, I said, stepping over the pile of stolen wealth. You think my grandfather cares about your firm's money. You think the man who was thrown into the river wants a Rolex. Then what do they want? He wailed, collapsing onto the sideboard. They want a home, I said softly. And since you destroyed mine by stripping it bare, they decided they liked yours better. But they don't like the neighbors. And they don't like you. Suddenly, the sideboard let out a sound like a gunshot. A massive crack split the top of the wood. From the fissure, a thick, black liquid began to ooze, the same silt from the pipes. It smelled of old sweat and ancient tears. Byron scrambled back, his hands covered in the oily mess. No, please. Go home, Byron, I said, turning back toward my door. Go back to your big, beautiful house. The one with the black vines and the screaming windows. You wanted to be the head of this family. A head needs a body. And the body of this family is currently residing in your foundation. Ruby, wait. I closed the door and locked it. I heard him screaming on the lawn for another hour, begging the empty air for mercy. But mercy is a luxury for the innocent. For the vultures, there is only the feast, and Byron was starting to look like the main course. When I looked out the window again at dawn, the sideboard was gone. He had dragged it back to his car. He couldn't leave it here. The wood wouldn't let him. It was tethered to him now, a heavy, mahogany shadow that would follow him until the debt was paid in full. I noticed something else on my lawn. Where the sideboard had sat, the grass wasn't dead. It was lush, green, and vibrant, growing 3 inches taller than the rest of the yard in a single night. The ancestors had left me a blessing, but they had taken Byron's sanity as a down payment. The walls of Byron's office at the firm were lined with degrees and awards, but none of those papers could shield him from the audit. By Monday morning, the missing funds, the bribe he'd tried to offer the ghosts on my lawn, had been flagged. But Byron didn't show up to explain. He couldn't. He was a prisoner in a fortress of his own making. I received a frantic call from Maya's boss. Ruby, we can't get a hold of either of them. The police went to the house for a wellness check, but they said they couldn't get past the gate. They said the smell of sulfur or old earth. It was so strong it made the officers gag. They are calling in code enforcement. I didn't tell him that code enforcement wouldn't find a gas leak. I just thanked him and hung up. I knew exactly what was happening. The debt was maturing. I drove back to the gated community one last time. This time, I didn't take my car all the way to the house. I parked at the entrance and walked. The air in Willow Creek had changed. It was stagnant, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. As I approached Byron's property, I saw the true scale of the infestation. The black vines had completely encased the front door. They weren't just plants. They were woven like iron bars, thick and glistening with that oily silt. The windows were opaque, covered from the inside with what looked like layers of dried mud and ancient newspaper clippings, the very things Byron had tossed out of the trunk. I saw Byron through a small gap in the garage door. He was trying to start his Mercedes. The engine would turn over, a pathetic, mechanical wheeze, and then die. I watched as he climbed out, sobbing, his expensive suit now little more than rags. He tried to run toward the street, but as soon as his foot hit the edge of the driveway, the ground seemed to ripple. The heavy paving stones shifted, rising up like a wave. Byron tripped, falling hard. From the cracks in the concrete, long, skeletal fingers made of twisted root and shadow reached up. They didn't grab him, they just blocked him. Every time he tried to cross the property line, the house itself seemed to lean forward, pulling him back into its shadow. You can't leave, Byron. I shouted from the sidewalk. He froze, looking at me with eyes that were no longer entirely human. They were yellowed, the color of old bone. Ruby, help me. Call them off. I'll tell the truth. I'll tell everyone what I did. The truth won't set you free when you've already sold your soul for the furniture, I replied, my voice steady. You took the life of this family. Now you have to live it. All of it. The hunger, the hiding, the running. You wanted the vintage experience. Well, here it is. I have the money, he screamed, pointing toward the house. I put it all back in the trunk. It's all there. Just let me out. The trunk doesn't want your stolen money, Byron. It wants the years you tried to shave off my life. It wants the respect you stepped on. Look behind you. Byron turned slowly. Standing in the darkened doorway of the house was a figure. It wasn't Terry. It was something older. It was a tall, shadowed man wearing a blacksmith's apron, his hands stained with soot and blood. In his hand, he held the iron hammerhead that Byron had ground into dust. The figure didn't move. It just watched. Byron let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a whimper of total, soul-crushing defeat. He realized then that he wasn't being haunted by ghosts. He was being processed. The house was a stomach, and he was the meal. Where's Maya? I asked, a flicker of maternal concern crossing my heart. She got out last night. Byron wheezed, his face pressed against the hot concrete of the driveway. She didn't even look back. She saw the man in the apron and she just ran. Why did he let her go? Ruby? Why only me? Because Maya has the blood, Byron. She belongs to the lineage. She might be weak, but she isn't a thief. You're a transplant, and the body is rejecting you. I felt a cold wind whip past me, carrying the scent of the delta. The shadows on the house began to swirl, closing the gap in the garage. Ruby, please, don't leave me here with them. I'm not leaving you with them, Byron, I said, turning my back on the monstrosity. I'm leaving you with yourself. That's the ultimate vengeance. You have to spend the rest of your time in that house being exactly who you are, surrounded by everything you stole, with no one left to impress. As I walked away, I heard the sound of the Mercedes windows shattering simultaneously. The house was sealing itself. No lawyers would come. No police would be able to breach those vines. To the outside world, it would look like a tragic case of a man who embezzled money and vanished into thin air with his wife. But I knew better. I knew that inside those black-vined walls, Byron was currently being forced to sit at the mahogany sideboard, served a dinner of silt and ash, while the ancestors told him stories of everything he would never be. The debt wasn't just paid. It was being collected, hourly. I returned to my own four walls, but the silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was expectant. I walked through the front door of my stripped bare house and felt a strange warmth radiating from the floorboards. Byron had taken the rugs, the chairs, and the portraits, yet the house didn't feel empty. It felt like it was catching its breath. I sat on the bottom step of the staircase, the only place left to rest. I didn't have to wait long. A soft knock at the door echoed through the hollow hallway. I didn't ask who it was. I knew the weight of that hand on the wood. I opened the door to find Maya. She looked like she'd crawled through a mile of brambles. Her hair was a bird's nest, and her eyes were wide, fixed in a permanent stare of shock. She wasn't carrying a purse or a suitcase. She was clutching a small, dough-caked bundle wrapped in one of my mother's old kitchen towels. "Mama!" she rasped. She stepped inside without being asked, her knees buckling as she hit the floor. His gone. Not missing gone. His integrated. I saw the house swallow the car. Mama. I saw the vines pull the Mercedes into the earth like it was nothing but a toy. I know, baby, I said, closing the door. Byron always wanted to be part of something big. Now he's part of the foundation. Maya looked up at me, a tear tracking through the soot on her cheek. I didn't stop him. When he was loading the U-Haul after the funeral, I stayed in the kitchen. I let him take the trunk. I let him call you senile because I was tired of the struggle. I wanted his life. I wanted the gated community and the fancy parties. I thought if I just let him take your things, the old way of living would finally die out and I could be modern. I'm just as bad as him, Mama. I looked down at my daughter. The betrayal I felt wasn't just Byron's greed. It was Maya's silence. That was the deeper wound. She had traded her mother's soul for a zip code. The blood doesn't lie, Maya, I said, my voice hardening. You watched a vulture pick at your own mother's ribs, and you handed him the fork. Why are you here now? Looking for a place to hide? No, she whispered. She unwrapped the bundle in her lap. Inside was the one thing Byron hadn't been able to open, the final jar. The one labeled with no date, only a name, Ruby. I found this in the guest house. He tried to smash it against the brick, but it wouldn't break. It just bounced. I realized then, he didn't take everything. He couldn't take you. She pushed the jar toward me. It was filled with a clear, shimmering liquid that looked like rainwater but moved like mercury. I don't want his money, Mama, Maya said, her voice growing stronger. I left the keys to the Mercedes in the dirt. I left the jewelry on the lawn. I realized that if I stayed in that house one more minute, the man in the apron was going to start looking at me the same way he looked at Byron. I picked up the jar. It was cool to the touch. The man in the apron is your great-great-grandfather, Maya. He doesn't like thieves, but he hates cowards even more. I'm not a coward anymore, she said, standing up. I'm the daughter of Ruby, and I'm going to help you put this house back together. Not with Byron's money. With our hands. I looked around the empty hallway. You think we can just buy new things and call it a home? No, Maya said, a dark glint appearing in her eyes. A glint I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. I think we should go back to his house. Not to save him, but to take back what's ours. The vines won't stop me, Mama. I'm a part of them. I felt a surge of pride, cold and sharp. My daughter was finally waking up. She realized that vengeance isn't just about destroying the enemy, it's about reclaiming the territory. The house in Willow Creek is no longer a house, Maya, I warned. It's a tomb. If you go back there, you're stepping into the belly of the beast. Byron is still in there, screaming. You'll have to hear him. Let him scream, Maya replied. It'll provide the music while I pack. I handed her back the jar of mercury water. Then go. If the ancestors let you in, bring back the sideboard first. I miss the way the wood catches the morning light. And Maya, if you see Byron, don't look him in the eye. He's not the man you married anymore. He's just a lesson now. Maya nodded, turned, and walked out into the night. She didn't take a car. She walked toward the gated community on foot, a woman returning to a site of a massacre to find her inheritance. I sat back down on the stairs. The house felt lighter. The debt was being managed. But I knew that Byron wouldn't go quietly. A man like that, even when he's being digested by the past, will try to take one last bite out of the living. I opened the jar Maya had brought me and took a small sip. It tasted like lightning and old memories. I closed my eyes and waited. I could hear the distant sound of a gate being torn off its hinges 3 miles away. The vengeance was no longer just mine. It was a family tradition. Maya didn't return by dawn. Most mothers would have spent the night pacing the floor, clutching their chests, and praying to a God they only talked to in emergencies. But I didn't. I sat in my kitchen, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light where my breakfast table used to be. I knew the rules of the house in Willow Creek. It doesn't take what it can't use, and right now, it was using Byron as a slow-burning fuel. Maya was blood. She was just going back to the well. It was nearly noon when I heard the sound of a heavy engine, not a Mercedes, but something older, something with a deep, guttural growl. I walked to the window and saw a rusted flatbed truck backing into my driveway. Maya was behind the wheel, her face smeared with grease and something that looked like soot, but her eyes were glowing with a terrifying clarity. Behind her, in the bed of the truck, sat my mahogany sideboard. But it wasn't alone. Wrapped in the thick, black vines from Byron's yard, the furniture looked like it had been reclaimed from the bottom of the ocean. The wood was wet, pulsing with a dull, rhythmic light. And sitting on top of the sideboard, huddled in a ball and shivering like a wet dog, was Byron. He wasn't the man who had stripped my house. He looked like he had been aged 50 years in a single night. His hair had turned the color of ash, and his skin was pulled tight over his bones, translucent and mapped with blue veins that seemed to twitch in time with the vines. "I got it, Mama," Maya said, hopping out of the cab. She didn't look at Byron. She looked at me with a hunger I'd never seen in her. The house let me take it, but it wouldn't let go of him. His part of the upholstery now. I walked out to the truck. Byron's eyes rolled toward me, but he couldn't move his head. The vines had threaded through the buttonholes of his tattered shirt and, from what I could see, were disappearing into his skin at the back of his neck. He was literally grafted to the mahogany. "Ruby," he wheezed. The sound was like dry leaves skittering on a sidewalk. "Please, untie. It hurts. The wood, it's drinking me." "It's not drinking you, Byron," I said, leaning over the side of the truck. I could feel the cold heat radiating off the sideboard. "It's just reclaiming the energy you spent stealing it. You wanted to be a pillar of the community. Well, now you're a pillar of my dining room." "Mama, what do we do with him?" Maya asked. She sounded indifferent, as if she were asking where to put a bag of mulch. "The neighbors in Willow Creek are all gone. They fled last night when the ground started to moan. The police tried to come in with a bulldozer, but the machine just stalled and sank into the lawn. That house belongs to the ancestors now. But they sent him back with the furniture." I realized then what the ancestors were doing. They didn't just want to punish Byron in private. They wanted him to be a witness. They wanted him to see the life he tried to destroy flourish while he withered away as a support beam for our history. "Bring it inside," I said. "Put the sideboard back where it belongs. Right in the hallway." "But Mama, he's attached to it," Maya pointed out. "I know. He wanted to be part of this house so badly he was willing to kill my spirit for it. I'm a generous woman, Maya. I'm giving him exactly what he asked for. He's going to be the foundation of our hospitality." It took two of the neighbors, men who knew better than to ask questions when they saw the state of Byron, to help Maya haul the sideboard into the house. They moved like they were in a trance. Their eyes avoided the shivering, moaning man-thing fused to the wood. We placed it exactly where it had stood for 40 years. The moment the sideboard touched the floorboards of my house, the entire building let out a sigh of relief. The air, which had been thin and cold, suddenly turned warm and sweet, smelling of baking bread and pipe tobacco. Byron let out a sharp cry as the vines began to spread from the sideboard into my floorboards. He was being anchored. He was the debt-made flesh, a living reminder of what happens when you try to take what wasn't earned. "Maya," I said, "go down to the cellar. There's one jar left that Byron missed because it was buried under the coal chute. It's labeled 1865. Bring it up." Byron's eyes widened. He knew that date. He knew that was the year of a different kind of reckoning. "Ruby, no," he begged, his voice fading to a whisper. I'll give you the accounts, the offshore millions." "You still think this is about money, Byron," I said, shaking my head with a touch of pity. "Psst, that's why you lost. You thought my life had a price tag. You thought you could buy your way out of a blood debt. But some things aren't for sale. Some things are only for keeping." Maya returned with the jar. It was filled with something dark and heavy, like liquid iron. I opened it, and the room filled with the sound of 1,000 distant voices humming a low, mournful tune. I looked at my daughter, then at the shell of the man who had tried to erase us. "He's going to stay here, Maya. He's going to watch us eat. He's going to watch us laugh. He's going to watch this house fill back up with the things he tried to sell. And every time he closes his eyes, he's going to feel the weight of every person who ever died with nothing so he could have everything." I poured a single drop of the liquid iron onto Byron's forehead. He didn't scream this time. He just went still. His skin began to harden, turning a deep, polished brown, the exact shade of the mahogany. He wasn't dead. He was just furniture. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was heavy with the presence of the new sideboard. Byron, or what was left of him, had become a permanent fixture in the hallway. To a stranger, he looked like a masterful, if slightly macabre, carving of a man in agony, woven into the very grain of the wood. But I knew better. When I walked past him in the morning, I could still feel the warmth of his terror radiating off the mahogany. I could still see the slight, rhythmic pulse of the vines under the varnish. But the world outside doesn't care about blood debts or ancestral justice. The world outside cares about missing assets. By Wednesday, the suburban peace was shattered by the arrival of two men in charcoal suits. They didn't look like the police. They looked like the kind of men who disappear people into legal paperwork, auditors from Byron's firm. They stood on my porch, looking at the lush, unnaturally green grass of my lawn with deep suspicion. "Mrs. Reed," the lead auditor asked. His name tag said Miller. He had eyes like a shark, flat and devoid of empathy. "We're looking for Byron Vance. We have reason to believe he may be hiding here. He's wanted for the embezzlement of nearly $4 million. I leaned against the doorframe, blocking their view of the hallway. "Byron isn't hiding, Mr. Miller. He's exactly where he belongs. But he isn't in any condition to discuss finances." Miller pushed his glasses up his nose. "We've already been to his house in Willow Creek. Or rather, where his house used to be. The authorities have condemned the property. They can't even get a drone over the lot without it crashing. We know he came here last." "He did," I said. "He brought back my furniture. He realized he'd made a grave mistake in his accounting." Just then, Maya stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. She looked different. Her skin had taken on a glow, and she was wearing the heavy iron rings from the debt box as a necklace. She looked less like my daughter and more like a queen returning from a war. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" she asked. Her voice was lower now, vibrating with the same hum that lived in the floorboards. Miller looked at her, and for the first time, his shark-like confidence wavered. He glanced past her into the house, his eyes landing on the sideboard. He frowned, stepping forward to get a better look at the carving of Byron. "That's an interesting piece," Miller remarked, his voice tight. "Almost looks lifelike. Is that Byron's watch on the wrist of that carving?" It was. The gold Rolex was fused into the wood, the second hand still ticking against the mahogany. "It's a family heirloom," Maya said, stepping between Miller and the sideboard. "It keeps perfect time with the heart of the house. Now, if you're looking for the money Byron took, you're looking in the wrong place. That money was spent on a down payment for his new residence. He's fully invested now." "We have a warrant to search the premises," Miller snapped, losing his patience. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "We're going to find that money, and we're going to find Vance." I stepped aside. "Come on in, then. But I should warn you, this house has a very strict policy regarding uninvited guests and the things they try to take." The two men stepped into the hallway. The moment their polished leather shoes touched the wood, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and ancient iron. Miller walked straight to the sideboard. He reached out a hand to touch the carving of Byron's face. This is warm. Why is this wood warm?" Suddenly, the house let out a low, guttural groan. The front doors slammed shut behind them, the locks clicking into place with the sound of breaking bone. "What was that?" the second auditor whispered, his face turning the color of ash. "That's just the house settling its accounts," I said, sitting in my high-backed chair. "You see, Byron thought he could steal from us. He thought he could strip the legacy of a family that survived everything this world threw at them. And you're here to take even more. You're here for the coins he tried to use as a bribe." Maya walked behind the men, her footsteps silent on the floorboards. "The money is in the basement, Mr. Miller. In the iron box. But I wouldn't recommend touching it. The last person who did, well, you're looking at him. Miller turned, his eyes darting between Maya and the sideboard. He finally saw the truth. He saw the way the eyes of the carving flickered under the light. He saw the vines beginning to creep out from the baseboards, wrapping around his own ankles. "What is this?" he shrieked, trying to kick his legs free. "What kind of sick game is this?" "It's not a game," I said, leaning forward. "It's an audit. And according to our records, you've spent your whole career helping men like Byron strip mine the lives of people like me. You've profited from the vultures for a long time, Mr. Miller. The ancestors think it's time you contributed to the foundation." The floorboards beneath the two men began to soften, turning into something that looked like dark, hungry mud. They started to sink, their screams muffled by the sudden, overwhelming scent of lilies and rot. "Mama," Maya said, her hand resting on the sideboard. "Should we keep them?" I looked at the auditors, then at the empty spaces in my house where my other furniture used to be. The hallway is a bit crowded, but the dining room still needs a new set of chairs, and I think Mr. Miller would make a very sturdy legs for a table. As the men were pulled down into the depths of the house, their suits turning into bark and their screams turning into the whistling of the wind, I felt a sense of completion. Byron wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a recruiter. The vintage vengeance wasn't just about one man. It was about anyone who thought they could walk into our history and take what they hadn't earned. The house was full again. Not with things from a store, but with the living essence of those who tried to destroy us. The house was finally quiet, but it was a heavy, satisfied silence. The auditors were gone. At least, they were gone from the world of paperwork and light. Now, they were part of the infrastructure. My dining room boasted two new chairs that felt remarkably solid, though they occasionally creaked with a sound that resembled a muffled sob when the wind blew from the north. Maya and I sat at the table, the mahogany glowing under the light of a single crystal chandelier that had returned to us via the vines of the backyard. I looked at my daughter. She wasn't the broken girl who had watched her husband strip my life away. She was the mistress of the house now. She moved with a grace that was ancient, her fingers tracing the grain of the table as if she were reading a map of our future. "It's done, Mama," she said, her voice a calm, resonant bell. "The firm has stopped calling. The police have marked the Willow Creek property as a geological anomaly. No one comes near the gate anymore. We are a ghost story now, and ghost stories are the best way to keep the world at bay." I nodded, sipping my tea. "People think vengeance is a fire, Maya. They think it's something that burns hot and then goes out. But real vengeance, it's a garden. You plant it, you water it with the tears of those who crossed you, and you watch it grow until it provides its own shade." I stood up and walked into the hallway. I stopped in front of the sideboard, the one with Byron's face permanently etched into the wood. His eyes were closed now, the gold Rolex on his wrist finally silent. He had been fully absorbed. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a pedestal for a vase of fresh lilies. "He looks peaceful," Maya remarked, joining me in the hallway. "He's useful," I corrected. "That's more than he ever was in life." I looked around my home. It was beautiful again, but it was a beauty born of iron and earth. Every piece of furniture, every jar in the cellar, every vine on the porch was a testament to the fact that you cannot bury the past, you can only invite it to dinner. We had taken the betrayal, the criminal greed, and the cold-hearted theft, and we had turned them into the mortar that held our lives together. The vultures had come to pick at my bones, but they found out too late that I wasn't the carcass. I was the trap. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The night air was cool, and the grass on my lawn was a vibrant, unnatural emerald. The neighborhood was silent, the other houses dark and fearful. They knew. They didn't know the details, but they knew that the house on the corner was no longer just a building. It was a living, breathing ledger of debts paid in full. "Are you happy, Mama?" Maya asked. I looked at the mahogany sideboard, then at the empty road where the world used to be. I felt the pulse of the ancestors in the floorboards beneath my feet. I felt the weight of the debt box, now resting securely in my bedroom, filled with the new iron rings we had forged from the intruders. I am satisfied, Maya, I said. And in this life, satisfaction is better than happiness. It lasts longer. I stepped onto the porch, my silver hair catching the moonlight. I was 60 years old, and I had never felt more powerful. I had lost my husband, my furniture, and my peace, only to gain a legacy that would never be stolen again. Byron thought he was taking everything. He didn't realize he was just becoming the first course of a very long, very cold meal. You see, the mistake people make is thinking that when someone grows old, they grow weak. They think that because we have memories, we are trapped in them. But memories are just the fuel for the fire we keep in the cellar. Byron wanted my things, but he ended up becoming one of them. And as for me, I'm still here. I'm still rocking on this porch. And I'm still waiting for the next vulture to think I'm an easy target. Because my house is always looking for a new set of legs for the table. If this story taught you anything, it's that you should never underestimate the woman who knows where the jars are buried. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark heart of vintage vengeance, make sure to smash that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the past never stays buried. Comment "The debt is paid" below to let me know you made it to the end. And don't forget to subscribe. We have plenty more stories of cold, calculated justice coming your way.